Chapter 13. While he'd stood guard at the restaurant, he got a call from his FBI contact, who'd gone over Agent Frank's head to the higher-ups in the California Bureau of Investigation and convinced them to send copies of the Starlet Slayer files. He'd forwarded the information to John's inbox. After they left the Patriot, Denise had wanted to go to not one but two different craft stores so she could find the perfect wreath and ribbons for Ella's project. All the while, John had itched to get home and look at the files. But from there, they'd picked up Ella, taken her to dance, and then watched the class. Though he'd enjoyed Denise's company more than he should have, he couldn't wait to get back and study what the police had learned about the murders. Now he stood in Denise's office and stared. He'd removed the bland artwork from the largest wall and taped up long strips of butcher paper, a lucky find at one of the craft stores. He'd affixed images of the victims and then written down all the details he knew about each murder. It helped to have it laid out like this. He gazed at the wall where he'd taped up a map of the Los Angeles area. He'd marked it up with 3 locations for each victim: home, blue; work, green; scene of the murder, red. Aside from the facts that all the women were well-known actors and all had been stabbed, there were no discernible patterns. The victims ranged in age from 20s to 40s. They lived from Malibu, west of LA, to Laguna Beach, south of the city along the coast. When they worked, they mostly did so in LA. Their murders were spread all around the area. 5 were killed at or near their homes, 1 while filming on location, 1 in her car, and the most recent in the bathroom at a restaurant. Some, like the latest victim, had been wildly successful A-list actors. Most had been actively working, but 2 hadn't worked in years. A blog post described one as washed up. They worked for all different studios, some in movies, some in TV. Some were known for comedy, others for drama. One was popular in action films. Some were single, some were married, some were divorced and remarried. Some had children, some had stepchildren, some had no children. 2 went to church regularly, though not the same church. The rest didn't attend any religious services. Some had memberships at fitness centers, but not the same fitness centers. The police had checked for common doctors, diet gurus, chiropractors, personal trainers, clothing stylists, hairstylists, manicurists. Some had a few of those in common, but none had them all in common. Police had checked for similar banks and other financial institutions, favorite grocers, mechanics, delivery services. Nothing, nothing, nothing. As far as John could tell, the only thing these women had in common, besides where they lived and what they did for work, was that they'd all been victims of the same killer. And what did Denise have in common with the women? Why had the killer singled her out? He kept the office door open just in case there should be another attack, though the evening team was protecting her now. He'd traded his private security hat for his private investigator hat. He didn't have much investigating experience. This would be good practice. Denise's laughter rose above the Christmas carols drifting from down the hall. Ella was chattering excitedly, adding her giggle to her mother's. He smelled garlic and chicken. They must have set aside the crafts to make dinner. Good for them. He forced himself to concentrate. There had to be a clue he was overlooking. He'd just turned his attention back to the wall when the sound of footsteps approached. Fast. He got to the door just in time to head off little Ella before she charged inside, saw the murder wall, and started asking questions. He hadn't been dumb enough to tape up crime scene photos, but still, he'd rather not have to explain to an 8-year-old what he was doing. "What's up, little bit?" "Mommy says you have to come and eat dinner with us." "I have to? Do I?" Her head bobbed. Any shyness she'd felt with him at their first meeting had fled entirely. She slipped her tiny hand around his fingers and tugged. "Come on. It's fettuccine Alfredo, my favorite, and Mommy makes it the very best." He probably shouldn't, but the scents were calling him. And how did anybody say no to this kid? She was too cute for words. After shutting off the light and closing the door, he allowed Ella to drag him, pretending to struggle, which elicited more giggles, into the kitchen. "I got him, Mommy." Denise turned from her place at the stove. She'd pulled her hair back in a ponytail, and she wore an apron over her jeans and sweater. "I hoped you might join us." He thought of the other guards on the property, All 11 of them. There were 6 on duty right now, Ella's 3 and Denise's 3. Surely she hadn't made enough for them all, which meant she'd singled him out, which he didn't mind one bit. But, I don't want to intrude. Don't be silly. I made enough for an army. Well, not really. Not even enough for your whole team. Will they be offended if I don't share? I told you, you don't have to feed us. After giving him a look he couldn't quite identify, shyness maybe, she stirred the bubbling pasta. Is it okay if I only share with you? I won't tell. Crap. Did that sound like he was flirting? Her eyes twinkled. It'll be our secret then. She turned to Ella, who'd climbed onto one of the bar stools. Can you keep a secret, love? Her head bobbed. Uh-huh. I didn't tell anybody when... She clapped her hand over her mouth, eyes wide. I almost did. He chuckled. You kept those words in. Good job. She beamed. Wow, she was adorable with those dark brown eyes. Have you been helping? Uh-huh. I buttered the bread and put on the garlic salt. She pointed to a short baguette that had been cut lengthwise. We're going to boil it. Broil it, Denise said. You broil food in the oven. You boil food in water on the stove. She pointed to a pot where steam rose. The fettuccine is boiling. Ella shrugged like she couldn't care less. To Denise, John said, What can I do? Put the bread in? To boil? She shot him a look, and he laughed as he grabbed it and did as she asked. Set the timer for 1 minute. He set his phone timer, then turned to see what else he could do just as Denise was preparing to lift the huge stock pot. Whoa, let me get that for you. I can do it, but if you insist. She stepped back and handed him the oven mitts. It's hot. He poured the pasta and water into the colander in the sink. Steam rose and heated his face, and he stepped back, bumping into Denise. Oh, sorry. Just supervising. Gotta make sure you don't screw it up. She winked at her daughter, who smiled in return. Mommy's the best cook. Daddy and Jackie are okay, but nobody's as good as Mommy. Is that so? John asked. The woman in question turned back to the stove and gave the white sauce a quick whisk. Not really. What's next? By the time the words were out of his mouth, his timer was going off. He removed the bread from the oven. It was bubbly and golden brown on top. The sense of butter and garlic had him itching to tear off a bite. While Denise chopped chicken she must have cooked on that little indoor grill on the counter, she nodded at the loaf and said, Slice that sucker up. On it. 5 minutes later, they settled at the kitchen table with plates of food in front of each of them. Not only had Denise made the Alfredo sauce from scratch, but she'd also chopped up a Caesar salad. Do you want to pray? She asked Ella. Okay. Denise and Ella held hands, each holding their other out to him. He took them both, relishing the feel. This was not where he should be. As a professional, he shouldn't get emotionally involved with his clients. But as a human being, as a man, he didn't want to keep his distance, and he didn't believe for 1 second that caring about the people he was protecting would make him less effective. If anything, it should make him more effective. Dear Jesus, Ella said, thank you for this yummy food and for Mommy who made it and for Mr. Donnelly who helped and for Daddy and Jackie and the baby. Let him be big and strong and not bite me. Amen. John stifled his chuckle. Amen. Denise cleared her throat and he guessed she too was trying not to laugh. That was a nice prayer. Ella twirled her fork in the creamy pasta. Jasmine at school has a little brother, and she said he bites her all the time. He even got in trouble at church for biting other kids. I see, Denise said. Smart to ask God for a brother who doesn't bite. The child had shoved a huge bite of food into her mouth, so she just nodded. John didn't say much during the meal, content to listen to Denise and her daughter chatter. Denise seemed so light-hearted with Ella. She'd seemed that way with Cassidy too for the most part. There'd been that one moment though when James had mentioned the kid who'd changed her tire. Denise's open expression had shifted to something he wasn't sure he could name. She'd lost a little color. Her eyes had dimmed. She'd even inched back a little in her chair and crossed her arms as if she'd felt attacked or ashamed. Why? Had something happened with that kid? Something she didn't want to talk about? Had he hurt her? Assaulted her? Or maybe she felt embarrassed about what had happened that day. Not that having a flat tire was anything to be embarrassed about. There was more to the story, and maybe the more would lead to the man who was trying to run her out of town. As much as the Starlet Slayer had consumed his attention that afternoon, the greater danger right now was the shooter here in Coventry. Was it the same person? Or two different killers? Either way, John needed to get to the bottom of what Denise had been thinking back at the restaurant. But based on the way she'd reacted, she wasn't going to share that more very easily. John gathered dishes from the table and carried them to the kitchen. Least he could do was clean up after she'd served that delicious meal. "Mommy, can we show Mr. Donnelly what we did?" "You want to see it, John?" Ignoring the warm feeling his name on her lips elicited, he said, "Sure." He set the plates in the sink and followed the girls into the living room. Denise had draped a cloth over the coffee table. He'd seen it earlier, covered in needles from the wreath and metal ornament hooks. The ornaments had been strewn across the white sofa. Now most of the mess had been cleared away. While Denise perched on the sofa, Ella stood by the table and lifted the wreath for him to see. He sat on the chair to get a good look. The evergreen circle was covered in brightly colored ornaments, not to mention some fake little red berries. "Wow, it's beautiful." Ella beamed. One by one, she pointed to all the ornaments and told him who each represented. They'd added one he hadn't seen before, a small nativity scene, and she pointed to it last. "Of course I'm thankful for Jesus, because without Jesus, there'd be no Christmas." He chuckled. "Christmas is pretty awesome." He leaned forward and studied the wreath closely. "And this is what you're most thankful for in the whole world?" "Uh-huh. My family and Jesus. They're the best presents ever." "You little bit are very wise. 'Cause I have a God who loves me, and he gave me all these people. Did he give you a good family too?" "I have a great family." John wasn't sure yet about the God part. "I have two big sisters." "They're not bigger than you, are they?" Her voice held a tinge of awe. He laughed, sharing a look with Denise. "No, not bigger, just older. Julie is 6 years older. She has two teenage boys, my nephews, and I get to take them to movies sometimes. Jenny is 4 years older. She's married and has little kids, but they live in Florida, so I don't see them often. And of course, I have amazing parents just like you do, and I have cousins. One of them is like a little sister to me." "I have cousins too," Ella said, "but I don't see them very much." "Do you see yours a lot?" "One of them. And you want to hear a secret?" At Ella's nod, he lowered his voice and said, "You get to see her too." Her eyes widened. "I do." "Yup, Miss Lake is my cousin." Her mouth formed a little O. "Cool. Is that right?" Denise's head tilted to the side. "Actually, now that you mention it, I can see some resemblance. Obviously, you're both really tall, but also around the mouth maybe?" "Don't tell her she looks like me. She'd cry herself to sleep." Denise laughed. Ella said, "Nuh-uh. You're cute." Heat filled his cheeks. He'd never been complimented by an 8-year-old. "Thank you. Not as cute as you, though." He tapped her button nose. "Their family must have lived near yours if you spent that much time together." He turned to Denise on the sofa. "Her family wasn't as stable as ours, so she stayed with us a lot when we were kids. I'm as close to her as I am my sisters. Actually, now that we work together, I'm closer to Lake." "So did she follow in your footsteps? Is that why she's a bodyguard?" "Not exactly." He wasn't about to explain how Lake had come to work with him. That was her story to tell. "Wow," Ella said. "You have lots to be thankful for, too." "I do," John said. "Lots and lots." She turned to her mother. "Can we do the ribbon now?" "Sure." Denise pulled spools from a sack, red, gold, and red and green checkered. "Which one do you like best?" Ella studied the options, then turned to John. "Which one do you think?" He looked to Denise for help. He didn't have a clue. "They're all pretty, but I think maybe the gold?" Denise smiled. "I'm partial to the gold too, and not just because it'd be pretty." Ella said, "How come?" "Gold is special," Denise said. "Real gold, that is. It's valuable today, and it was valuable even back when Jesus was a baby. Remember the gifts the wise men brought? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh." "Frankincense and myrrh are some sort of scented something," Denise said. "But gold?" "Everybody knows what that is," Ella said. Denise ran a hand over her daughter's hair. She touched her often, like it was her way of showing love, of connecting. Or maybe after a long separation, she just couldn't help herself. Gold is one of the most valuable metals on the planet. It's been used as money for thousands of years. Really? And it's an interesting metal because it's very malleable. Ella squinted, her question obvious. Malleable means it can be shaped. In the case of gold, very easily. Denise slipped a ring from her right hand and handed it to Ella. See how it's not an exact circle? It's a little tight, and over the years, it's molded itself to my finger. And that's not even pure gold. They have to combine it with other metals so it'll keep its shape. Ella studied the ring, then handed it back. Is that why you like gold? All girls like gold, Denise winked, and diamonds. But the point is, I think it would represent something important about your wreath. Real gold can be stretched and molded, like a family. See, when your daddy and I first got married, it was just us. And of course, our parents were our extended family. But then the family stretched to include you. And now it's stretched even more to include Jackie and her parents. And pretty soon, a baby, Ella said. It's going to have to stretch even more. That's right. So to me, gold is the right color because real gold can shape itself to cover any family, no matter how big or unique it might be. It's sort of like the family of God. When you give your heart to Jesus, you get to join God's family along with all the other people who love Jesus. And then you have brothers and sisters all over the world. They're all different colors and shapes and sizes. They speak different languages and come from different cultures, but they're still your brothers and sisters in Christ. It was clear Ella didn't fully comprehend what her mom was saying. Rather than ask for clarification, she said, "Cool," and picked up the spool of gold ribbon. "Can you show me how?" "We'll do it together." John probably should have excused himself, done the dishes, and returned to the office-turned-murder room. Instead, he watched as Denise instructed Ella in attaching the ribbon to the wreath. He would have just wrapped it around. But what Denise had in mind was more creative, beautiful, even more so because she didn't do it herself. Rather, she directed Ella, "Maybe pinch it there. Twist it here, see? Let's put a dab of glue." Ella followed her instructions. When they were done, the simple wreath looked like a work of art. Ella lifted it for him to see. "Wow, that's amazing," he said. Her grin stretched wide, pure joy. "I can't wait to show Dad." The contentment on Denise's face faded, and she pushed to her feet. "I'll put it in a plastic bag to protect it for the ride." Ella set it back on the table. "Can I leave it here? Daddy can see it at the Christmas party at school." "You don't want to take it home?" "I thought, can we hang it up here?" If John weren't mistaken, he caught the sheen of tears in Denise's eyes. "Of course, love. Where do you want to put it?" Ella decided it should go on the back of the door, and Denise didn't bat an eye when she asked John to drive a nail into the glimmering wood. After they'd hung it, they enjoyed homemade peanut butter cookies, the kind with chocolate kisses pressed onto the top, and hot chocolate in front of the fire while Christmas carols played in the background. Everything about the space, from the sparkling tree to the crackling fire to the scents of chocolate and pine, drew him in. Denise and her daughter completed the perfect holiday picture. Again, John didn't contribute much to the conversation. An irritating voice kept telling him he should leave them alone, but he ignored it. This house was completely different from the colonial he'd grown up in, the tree more subdued than his parents' flashing, multicolored one, and the family smaller. But the sense of it, the feeling of comfort and home, he liked it. He liked little Ella. He liked Denise. More than he should. Ella's gaze strayed off into the wreath, and each time she smiled. Denise had claimed more than once that she wasn't a good mother. It was clear by the way Ella watched her with admiration and adoration that nobody had told her that. If John wasn't careful, his own expression would reflect those same feelings, feelings he had no business having about a client.
Chapter 14. It had been a perfect afternoon. Denise hated for it to end, but as she waved to Ella, she felt not sad but buoyed. This wasn't goodbye, it was see you soon. She'd call Reed to find out when she could see her again. Probably not Tuesday, but Wednesday or Thursday at the latest. Reed wouldn't be happy, but he'd learn to share. Like her daughter had been, Denise was surrounded by bodyguards for the short walk from the driveway to her front door. When she stepped inside, only John followed. Usually, bodyguards got on her nerves. She'd learned to tolerate them when Ella was visiting, but was always happy to see them gone. But John was different. She liked having him around. He made her feel safe, but it was more than that. His presence was calming, gentle, and if he judged her, it wasn't harshly. In fact, the way he'd joined them for dinner and then stayed to look at the wreath, he could have easily made an excuse after the meal and disappeared, but he hadn't. It was almost as if he liked her. Denise had fair-weather friends, fake friends, and fans. She had a few genuine girlfriends at church, and their husbands were cordial enough, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd been with a man who simply liked her. Not because of her fame or her looks, but just because of who she was. Inviting John to dinner had been Ella's suggestion, but Denise could admit, in the privacy of her own mind, that her heart had leapt at the idea. Maybe John liked her, maybe he didn't, but she definitely liked him. Too much. And now she sounded like a middle schooler with a crush. When he closed the front door, he said, "You did a great job with it." He was admiring the wreath. "I think it came out pretty well. You're a woman of many talents." Arts and crafts had always come easily to her, as had cooking and acting, and that was about it. "Not many talents," she corrected, heading for the kitchen. "I've learned to focus on things I'm naturally good at and ignore the things I'm not." "Like singing." She laughed. "It's not that bad. It's not that good." "Okay then, how about you?" She started clearing the table they'd ignored earlier. "Can you sing?" "I can carry a tune, but I'm no Bing Crosby." He turned on the water. With that deep, soothing voice, he could knock White Christmas right out of the park. "Let me be the judge of that. Sing something for me." He squirted dish soap into the sink. "I don't think so." She transferred the leftover pasta to a storage container. "Come on, one little line. A carol." "Nope." He started rinsing dishes. "How about this?" she said. "I'll sing, and you can join in." "Please don't. I just got my ears to stop bleeding from the last time." She smacked him with a kitchen towel. He chuckled. "Was that supposed to hurt?" "Oh, but you've told me how to hurt you." She belted out the first line of Jingle Bells. Her singing voice really was atrocious. He covered his ears with soapy hands. "Stop! It burns!" Her song morphed into a laugh. "Come on, coward! Sing for me!" When he didn't, she picked up her song where she'd left off. His eyes were mirthful when he glanced her way, shaking his head. And then he joined in. She wasn't wrong. John might not have had Bing Crosby's voice, but he had talent. She quieted so she could hear him better, though he didn't seem to notice, switching from Jingle Bells to Winter Wonderland smoothly. Finally, as she stowed the remainder of the food and wiped the counters, she let her voice fade entirely, not wanting to ruin his song. He sang a low tenor, smooth as cream pie. When everything but the dishes were done, she grabbed a clean towel and dried the pots he'd propped on the counter. Finished washing and the song fading, he held the colander toward her to dry. "Well, what's the verdict?" She took it, accidentally, or maybe not, brushing his fingers with her own. "Not bad." And then she smiled. "Really good. You should sing more often." The shy look he gave her made her heart flutter. She swallowed and focused on the task. What was she doing? Flirting with her bodyguard? Stupid. This man was staying in her house. What if he got the wrong idea? What if he took advantage? He wouldn't. Would he? No, he was a protector. She'd stayed in the same house with John for 2 nights, and he'd been nothing but a perfect gentleman. That she feared anything else had nothing to do with his character, and everything to do with her own demons. "You did a great job with Ella today." He dried his hands. "You think so?" Warmed by the compliment, Denise opened and closed a couple of cabinets before she found where the colander went. "The way you used the gold ribbon to talk about your family, that was really insightful. It made me think of my own, with my sisters and their husbands and kids, and of course, Sue Lake." Sue? Is that her name? No. He lifted the dirty towel. Where do you want this? Denise grabbed it. Suzanne? Suzette? No and no. Sully? He just raised his eyebrows. Come on, now I have to know. She'd kill me, and don't let my superior size fool you. She could do it. Only because you wouldn't fight back. His lips tipped up at the corners. True. Sabrina? Savannah? You aren't going to let this go, are you? It's just a name, right? She doesn't like people to know. Why? He grabbed a cookie from the bowl and leaned against the counter. Not my name, not my story. There's a story about her name? He blew out a long breath. You're annoyingly persistent. It's another of my talents. He just shook his head, though she saw amusement in those dark eyes. I'm going back to work. Thanks for including me for dinner and the wreath and stuff. It was fun. Next time I'll let you play with the glue gun. Chuckling, he rounded the island, but she wasn't ready to be alone yet. It was too early to go to bed, and she was too hyped up after the day with Ella to watch TV or read. She followed him. What are you working on? I got the files from Agent Frank. He stopped at the entrance to the hallway, and she froze halfway across the living room, feeling like an irritating little sister. She should leave the man in peace. And then she realized what he'd said. On the murders? Anything interesting? I've been perusing them. When you have a chance, I want to show you. Maybe something will jump out at you. Why can't we do that now? He made a show of looking at his watch, one of those giant things that probably worked 1,000 feet underwater. It's a little late to be thinking of serial killers, isn't it? Isn't that what you're about to do? It's my job. It's my life. He conceded that with a nod. If you want. She wasn't sure she wanted to think about the starlet slayings tonight, but she did want to keep talking to John, so she followed him into the office. One wall was covered with butcher paper. He'd bought a roll at the craft store, but she hadn't bothered to ask why. Now she knew. He'd taped pictures of the victims across the top. Beneath each one, he'd written facts about them. Some of those facts were circled or underlined, and she realized he was indicating similarities. There were very few. None of them had everything in common except the obvious. They were all female actors. Otherwise, what am I missing? He leaned against the front of her desk. She gazed at the facts as he'd laid them out, then at the map on the adjacent wall, and tried to think of something. Anything he hadn't covered. Studios they've worked for? He pointed, and she saw he'd written those nearer the bottom of the paper. People they've worked with? Actors, directors, producers. The police complied that list. She remembered something she hadn't thought about since the first victim. I know someone who worked with Lauren Leahy. She nodded to the photo of the sitcom star. She was an aspiring actress, but she worked as a makeup artist at the studio. She and Lauren became, not friends, but they were friendly. His expression perked up. Could you reach this woman? Yeah. She went to college with me, and when I decided to go to LA, she came too. We shared an apartment for a couple of years. She never was able to land a meaningful role. She did some stand-in work, a couple of commercials, but not enough to pay the bills. She's still in LA? She gave up a few years back. I think she lives here now. Here is in New Hampshire somewhere. Do you think she'd talk to us? Maybe she knows something about the victims we don't. Can't hurt. Denise found Brittany's contact information. She sent a text and got a response almost immediately. She's available tomorrow. Should I set it up? He smiled. That'd be great. Good idea. It was stupid. The rush of pleasure that came with his offhand remarks. She texted Brittany back. After her friend replied, she said, We're going to meet her at 4 in Portsmouth. Good, good. He seemed genuinely pleased. It's good to have a next step. Denise leaned against the door jamb. Maybe she'll have some insights for us. Any information is helpful. The more pieces of the puzzle we get, the clearer the image will be. Speaking of, he pressed his hands against the desk behind him and angled back. Can I ask you something? The seriousness in his voice had her worried. I guess. Today at the restaurant, when you were talking about that kid who changed your tire. She crossed her arms. What about him? You seemed, he shrugged, almost nervous. Realizing he was watching her closely, she uncrossed her arms and settled into a relaxed stance. But John seemed to miss nothing, just watched her try to pretend all was well. Did he hurt you? What? No, nothing like that? His eyebrows hiked. The man could speak volumes with those eyes. When you were hired, did you have to sign some sort of non-disclosure agreement? He leaned farther back. I did. Even if I hadn't, I wouldn't tell anybody anything about you without your permission. Should she believe him? She'd worked so hard to keep her secrets to herself. Part of her, a big part of her, wanted to tell somebody besides her counselor the truth. Not just somebody, though. John. It's just that I wasn't exactly sober. Oh. He dipped his head to the side and squinted. How not sober were you? Very? Is that a regular thing for you? Drinking and driving, or just… Not anymore, but back then. Not the driving, usually. In LA, I would hire a driver or ride with friends. But here, she sighed. I'd gotten into an argument with my parents. I had a rental car, and I just took off. Drunk, he clarified. And I'd taken some pills. His head bobbed a couple of times, all amusement erased. That's something you still do? Never. Remember I said I was in the hospital when… Ah, you were in rehab when your daughter was kidnapped. The offhand way he said the words she'd never said to Reed or her parents or Ella, had her heart thumping. I wanted to be here. Everything in me wanted to check myself out and get on a plane. I was so scared. I thought, if she'd died, I'd have probably joined her. I would not have survived it. And if she'd just disappeared, was never found? She swallowed the emotion rising with the memories. I still have nightmares. He nodded, but said nothing. But I'd just finished detoxing. I wasn't strong enough to leave. I definitely wasn't strong enough to handle the pressure, the fear. And this is the hardest place to be because of my parents and Reed. All the reminders about how I let them all down. Which they won't let you forget. I deserve their contempt. He scowled at that. My counselor at the rehab hospital told me that if I came home and relapsed, I would take focus off finding Ella and put it onto me. Nothing good could come of that. It wasn't as if I'd be able to find her, and definitely not if I wasn't sober. Reed and our parents didn't need to deal with my issues. So I stayed. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Her voice cracked with emotion. I swore that if God saved Ella, I'd never take another pill, never touch another drop of alcohol. I take it you've kept that vow? I've been sober for 4 years, 4 months, and… She quickly did the math. 17 days. That's something to be proud of, Denise. Why are you ashamed of it? I'm not. Again, his disagreement showed in his expression. I'm not ashamed of getting clean. I mean, I don't really want Reed to know. It would only give him more fodder to use against me. And I'd prefer Ella not know. But it would be better than them thinking I didn't care enough to be here. She shrugged. If they knew, it would be fine. God's grace is big enough to cover me despite their opinions. God's grace. Is it malleable like gold? A hint of humor carried in his voice. Incredibly, it stretches over the ugliest sins. Humor fading, he seemed to consider that. But you haven't told anybody the truth. Wouldn't it be better if they knew why you didn't come home? I have a contract with the studio, and there's a morals clause. I mean, it's a gray area. Addiction is a medical condition, but it's also a choice. One can't get addicted to drugs if one never uses them. And I signed a contract that said I wouldn't. Would the studio have canceled my contract? Probably not. But would they renew it? She lifted her shoulders, let them drop. It's not that they care that I used drugs or went to rehab, not really. It's that they don't want my reputation sullied. My work was all I had. I was afraid to lose it. I was afraid that if I lost that, my life was hanging by a very thin strand. I felt like I was always fighting a death wish, fighting the belief that the world would be better off without me. If I lost my job, surely your family wouldn't have told anybody. Maybe. Why can't you tell them now? My contract is up for renewal, so it would be better if it doesn't come out. But I'm stronger now than I've been in a long time. I could handle losing my job, losing Ember Flare. She felt silly using the name of the superhero she played. Unlike before, I know who I am. I can differentiate between who I am, a child of God, loved and forgiven, and what I do. I'd rather not lose my job, but you don't trust Reed not to tell anybody. Do you think I should? Well, if your contract were canceled, you could stay here full-time. Maybe if he knew that. Ha! Good point! She laughed. There's the incentive he'd need to keep his mouth shut. That's all I'm saying. His eyes softened, filled with warmth and kindness. Thank you for trusting me with that. His gaze flitted to the wall beside her, and he sat up. Maybe that's the connection. Do you think these women went to rehab or struggled with addiction? She followed his gaze. I hadn't thought of that. We should find out. Denise and her cadre of bodyguards left the house the following afternoon under low-lying clouds. Maybe it would snow. She'd always loved snow when she was a kid. It was one of the many things she'd missed living in LA. Today, it was certainly chilly enough, the temperature hovering in the 20s. They had an hour-and-a-half drive ahead of them, and they were giving themselves a little wiggle room to get to the meeting place early. She was accustomed to sitting in the back seat of the luxury SUV behind two bodyguards, so when John opened the passenger door for her, she felt flush with pleasure. He offered no explanation as he climbed into the driver's seat. The other three bodyguards occupied the second SUV, which followed them down Rattlesnake Road. Denise had awakened, feeling a weird combination of giddiness and embarrassment. John had already seen a lot of the ugliness in her life. Now he knew about her addiction as well. He'd already alerted Special Agent Frank to the possibility that the victims had substance abuse recovery in common, without mentioning Denise's struggles. But Frank said they'd already checked out that angle, leaving Denise feeling unsettled. Had she overshared? She could pretend now that she'd told him about the drugs and alcohol, because the information might help him figure out the connection among the Starlet Slayer's victims. But that wasn't what she'd been thinking. She'd been thinking that she wanted him to know. She'd gotten the impression that he liked her, and she'd wanted to know if his feelings, however light and tenuous they were, would last if he knew the truth about her. Not that she'd told him everything. She'd never told anybody but her counselor everything. John had claimed to believe that her years of sobriety were something to be proud of. Did he still feel that way? Did he still like her? How silly and childish she was. But it felt good to make a new friend. And if his feelings went beyond friendship, she wasn't ready to face that. Even if he felt something more for her, she had no idea what that would look like or how it would work. And he wasn't a Christian, so she shouldn't even be entertaining the thoughts. The thoughts were rather entertaining, though. John didn't speak until they'd driven through Coventry. I wanted to ask you another question, and I thought you'd prefer to answer in private. Oh? And here she'd hoped he'd wanted to spend time alone with her. Okay. A long silence followed. The longer it stretched, the more her guard went up. And then he said it. Why did you leave your family? No. Of all the things, of all the questions, hot shame and cold fear mixed inside her. Hadn't she already bared enough to this man? Couldn't he wish to know something about her that she'd be proud to share? But no, he asked the hardest question imaginable. She had a story she could tell him, of course, a story she'd told everyone. And it was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. She could share it, but even if he bought her pat answer, which she doubted, she didn't want to lie to this man. She wouldn't. No. I know it's personal, John said, but I've learned that sometimes it's the personal things that connect us. Maybe that's the connection. It's not. He blew out a long breath. Denise? No, I can't tell you. Stupid tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them back. 8 years had passed. 8 years, and she still couldn't think about that time without crying. She crossed her arms against the sudden chill in the car. He adjusted the heat, missing nothing. I didn't mean to upset you. I just want to put the picture together. How could the reason I left Coventry have anything to do with murders in LA? Maybe it has to do with the guy who's taken 2 shots at you here. It doesn't. There wasn't anybody else? A man? No, of course not. Never. Reed and I were in love. I would never have cheated on him. He didn't voice a follow-up question, but he didn't have to. If they were so in love, then why had she left? It's complicated. Relationships usually are. His voice carried none of the judgment she expected. The judgment he no doubt felt. Was he as in love as you were? Was there another woman? No, you don't. How could John possibly understand what their lives had been like? None of what's happening now is related to what happened back then. Somebody wants you out of Coventry. Maybe it's the kid who helped you change your tire, but my money says it's not. Not that she'd suspected that sweet, gentle kid, but still she asked, why? Because he'd be, what? 22? Even if he could, at his age, shoot a crossbow 80 yards with that accuracy, I don't see a 22-year-old having the patience to wait 9 hours. 9 hours? What are you talking about? Oh, he glanced her way. I guess I didn't tell you that. We finally found the guy on video. He army crawled across your property while you and Ella were in North Conway. He waited until he thought everybody was asleep. Wow, that had taken some planning and patience. Guys in their 20s are cockier than that, John said. More daring, less disciplined. I assumed the person had military training, but unless this guy enlisted at 18 and then was discharged early for some reason. He shook his head. No, my instincts tell me it's someone older. Considering the personal nature of the note, it's probably somebody who knows you, or at least thinks he knows you, which means it's probably somebody you know or used to know. If not from high school, then from college, or after you were married. Reed was faithful to me. I was faithful to Reed. There was nobody else. You're certain about Reed? Unequivocally, yes. Mind if I ask him? Go for it, but you'll be wasting your time. John nodded, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. And there was nobody else who wanted to be with either one of you? Rivals for affection? Not that I'm aware of. John drove in silence a few minutes before he asked, Did Reed ever... Was he abusive? What? No, never. Why would you even ask that? His jaw tightened, a look she'd seen when he was angry. His lips were pressed closed, as if he were debating saying something, or trying not to, or maybe debating how. Finally, he spoke. I've had the feeling a couple of times that you're afraid. Someone's taken a shot at me, twice. And you weren't as scared as you should have been, in my opinion. It's not that. It's yesterday, when you were talking about that kid on the road. I explained that. He nodded, but clearly wasn't mollified. Sometimes you seem very self-protective, more so than most, often when you're talking about Reed. He's cruel to you, I know. I just wondered if it used to be more than words. Look, I know he acts like a jerk sometimes. He needs to forgive me, and he's trying. But what I did to him, it was my fault. I had an infant, this beautiful little girl I loved, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to be happy. I was miserable. John was silent, giving her time to elaborate. She'd told herself she wasn't going to tell him why she'd left, and now she was delving into the story. She needed to shut up. Were you suffering postpartum? John asked. I hear that can be rough. That was an easy one. Yeah, in retrospect, I realize it was really bad. Really bad. But at the time, I just thought there was something wrong with me. And Reed, she sighed. He didn't understand, of course. How could he? He had this new beautiful baby and this weepy, useless wife. Maybe a little compassion wouldn't have hurt. We were 22. What did you just say about guys in their 20s? They're rash, yeah. They're also arrogant and dumb. We were both so dumb, but we thought we knew everything. At least I had thought that, until Ella was born. Then it felt like I didn't know anything. We were still in college when I got pregnant. We'd had all these plans. Maybe, maybe they were mostly my plans. I'd always wanted to be an actor. I figured we'd graduate, and then I'd start trying to break into the industry. I'd done some community acting, studied theater in college, and I was pretty good. He said he'd go anywhere with me, that he'd support me. But then I got pregnant. We got married. Ella came along, Reed got a job, and we bought a house in Coventry, and it felt like the world was closing in on me, like my life was over, and all I had to look forward to was years of darkness. And so you left? There was more to it. So much more. But she hadn't meant to tell John as much as she had. She definitely wasn't going to tell him the rest. None of that has anything to do with what's happening now. Okay. After a moment, he said, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to dredge up bad memories. Sure you did. His Adam's apple bobbed, and he glanced her way. I meant to get the information. I didn't realize how hard it would be for you to share. They drove a long time in silence. When they reached Lake Winnipesaukee, she stared at the expanse of gunmetal gray. The water was choppy, and the clouds hid the mountains that surrounded the giant lake. Even still, there was beauty. Beauty in the rough surface that hid the clear waters. Beauty in the spindly pines that stood guard year-round. Beauty in the bare trees that waited patiently for spring. That was life, wasn't it? Sometimes hard, ugly, choppy. But, like the majestic peaks, the beauty was there, just waiting to be revealed. There'd been a time in Denise's life when the biggest battle was simply surviving to face another day. When she'd pop any pill or swallow any drink just to shut up the voices telling her she shouldn't exist, that she didn't deserve to exist. Anybody who claimed there was no such thing as Satan and his minions wasn't paying attention, because that voice, that sneering, snickering, evil voice, telling her she ought to end it all, that voice did not belong to her. Her enemy had almost won. But even in the midst of the ugly, God had shown her beauty. He'd shown her in beautiful sunrises over the canyon, in good triumphing over evil scripts, in kind words from co-stars, friends, strangers. Mostly, in those days when she woke up hungover, hating herself, she'd see a picture of her daughter, all innocence and light, and think, for her. Today, I'll be better. For her. It had taken years to reach today. But eventually, she'd done it. Now, on the other side of it, she spent her life searching for beauty, which was why she could look past Reed's hateful comments and angry glares and remember the man he used to be, the man he still was with everybody but her. She didn't want to be judged for her ugliest moments, and she refused to judge others for theirs. They stopped at a light, and John faced her. I should have trusted you. You told me it wasn't related, and I should have believed you. I shouldn't have pried. I'm sorry. True regret showed on his face. He watched her, waiting for her response, as if fearing she'd hold a grudge. She'd never been good at grudge holding, though. Grudges were heavy. They only weighed a person down. You're trying to keep me safe, she said. I appreciate that. So we're good? She smiled. We're good. I'm sorry I got emotional. You don't owe me anything. His gaze flicked downward. To her lips? Was he thinking? But the light turned green, and he accelerated through the intersection. Of course he hadn't been thinking about kissing her. Ridiculous to even consider such a thing. That she was now thinking about kissing him. She liked him, too much. She hadn't felt this kind of attraction for anybody since Reed. And she'd been head over heels for him. But that wasn't what was happening now. It couldn't be. Could it? Chapter 15. Prescott Park looked mostly deserted when they arrived. While the bodyguards scoured the area for threats, Denise and John waited in the SUV. I don't like this, John said. Nobody knows we're here. It'll be fine. But his lowered brows and intense gaze told her he wasn't convinced. You should have told me the meeting place. She had told him they were meeting at an old haunt in Portsmouth. He'd assumed a restaurant, but that wasn't her problem. You should have chosen someplace enclosed. Maybe she can get in the car? Denise appreciated that he was trying to keep her safe, but they were an hour and a half from Coventry, and nobody except herself, John, and Brittany knew they were going to be here. Were we followed? Of course not. We're not amateurs. Then what's the problem? It's not secure. Why does it matter anyway? Why not meet at her place of work or something? She suggested this, and I like Prescott Park. Brittany and I used to perform at the theater here. We have good memories. It's freezing. John wasn't wrong about that. The dashboard display told her the temperature outside hovered near 30. We're dressed for it. Can we go now? I don't want to miss her. Obviously not happy about it, he rounded the car and opened her door. Stay close. Do as I say, okay? Yes, boss. Not even a smile. The steady breeze made it feel colder than the temperature indicated. Fortunately, Denise wore a toasty, warm, fur-lined jacket. She took a knit cap from her pocket and pulled it down over her ears, then slid on her gloves as she headed toward the gate where Brittany had suggested they meet. They passed some of the old houses that made up the Strawberry Bank Museum, which were decked out for the holidays. Trees, garland, wreaths galore. She wished it were dark and the holiday lights were lit. Portsmouth had always been extra charming at Christmas time. They entered the park and were walking beneath the barren trees when John asked, "What can you tell me about this woman?" She was a theater major, like me. We were friends. She's not as good an actor as you, I assume. I wouldn't say that. She's taller than average, which limits the number of roles a person can get. She's a good dramatic actor, but not great with comedy. She's a very nice person, but kind of shy, which doesn't help her connect with people. There's so much competition. Everything has to work out, and she just never had the pieces fall into place. You're good at focusing on the best in people. She looked down to hide her flush of pleasure. We celebrated victories together. At first, those were few and far between. More often, we commiserated when we were passed over for parts. We'd buy a couple of pints of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, Cherry Garcia for me, Chunky Monkey for her, and tell each other how all the casting directors were stupid to overlook us. Denise remembered those days as hard and frustrating, but also fun and simple. Things had changed when Denise started getting parts, and Brittany didn't. I probably didn't treat her very well, she said. When I got the Ember role, I bought a house, leaving her to find a new roommate. In retrospect, I should have invited her to live with me or given her more notice. I was pretty selfish back then. John stopped cold, gaze flicking around the barren park. A few folks walked through it, probably more to get to their destinations faster than to enjoy the scenery. Was she angry with you? Did you argue? She's not my enemy, John. If she was angry, she never said so. He started walking again, though he looked even less happy about this meeting than he had earlier. The other bodyguards hovered nearby. She felt safe, surrounded by all of them. The guy who'd taken the shot at her at the park in Coventry could have seen her coming. He probably caught sight of her Tesla. She should have bought something a little less conspicuous, and realized she was there. And she'd sat on that picnic table by herself for a long time. Plenty of time for someone to get on a boat. This was different. By the time anybody could get set up to harm her, she'd be leaving. And anyway, John had said nobody followed them. A tall woman approached on the path, still a good 50 yards away. Brittany had put on a little weight, but it only enhanced her features. She'd always been attractive with her light brown hair and dark brown eyes, that perpetually tanned skin that came from her Italian roots. That's her, Denise said. I'll be close if you need me. I'll ask our questions, so when you're done visiting, let me know and I'll join you. He added, if that's okay. She nodded and he moved away. Brittany's smile was probably her most memorable feature. It wasn't Julia Roberts wide, but it was big and inviting. Denise opened her arms, and Brittany stepped into them and hugged her tight. How are you? Backing away to get a better look at her, Denise said, I'm happy to see you. I've missed you. It's been a long time. They walked along the path, settling into conversation as easily as if it had been 5 weeks, not 5 years, since they'd last seen each other. Denise told Brittany about playing Ember Flare, about mutual friends and what they were up to, about what she was doing back in New Hampshire. How's that going then, reconnecting with Ella? Brittany asked. Really great. We've spent time together over the past few years, so it's not as if we're strangers. But being here with her, being able to do everyday things with her, I love it. I'm so glad. And the stuff you were dealing with back then, the drinking and… Been sober more than 4 years? Wow! The surprise in her voice was almost insulting. Didn't think I had it in me, did you? Denise expected Brittany to laugh, but she stopped, tilted her head to the side, and studied her through narrowed eyes. Honestly, there were times I worried, really worried about you. But you look great, like a new person. I am, not just sober either. I returned to my faith. Well, good for you. The way she said the words told Denise she wasn't interested in hearing about that. Denise would have to keep in touch. Maybe she'd have an opportunity to share her faith another time. Tell me about what you've been up to. It seemed Brittany had done well for herself since she'd given up the dream of being an actor. She'd returned to New Hampshire and opened an art gallery here in Portsmouth. Wow! Denise almost asked how her friend had funded such an expensive venture, but she held her tongue. Considering her success compared to Brittany's lack thereof, it seemed a bad idea to discuss money. I'm proud of you. I'd like to visit it someday. She quickly added, but probably not today. I've got other things going on. She really did want to see the gallery, but not surrounded by burly bodyguards who might scare away Brittany's customers. Just as well, Brittany said. I have an appointment this evening. How long will you be in New Hampshire? Through New Year's, at least. That long? She seemed pleased. We're showing a great local artist in a couple of weeks, Donovan Gilchrist. Ever heard of him? I haven't. He's really good. You should look him up. And if you have time, I'd love it if you'd come to the show. I'll send you the details. Thanks. It seemed like her friend had found her niche. I looked you up on social media last night, but I couldn't find you. Brittany lifted her shoulders and let them drop. You could find the gallery, but me? I gave up Instagram a few years ago. I kept comparing my life to everyone else's. It turned out so differently than I'd planned. Looking at everybody else's successes, it wasn't healthy. It's funny, isn't it? Denise said. Some people look at my life and think how lucky I've been, but I look at yours and think the same thing. I love acting, but sometimes I hate the stuff it comes with. People long for fame, and I long to be a normal person. People long to be actors, and I long for anonymity. She sighed and added, I long for a family. Do you really? Because you had that and you left it. Denise wasn't offended or even surprised by Brittany's question. That directness was one of the things she'd always liked about her friend. I wish I'd stayed. I wish I'd sought help for the depression and stuck it out. But you've done such good work. The world would have survived if somebody else had been cast as Ember Flare. Nobody else can play Ella's mom. That's the role I should have fought for. She struggled against the melancholy that tried to descend. There'd been a lot of such conversations lately, and each time regret gripped her ankles and tried to yank her down. She kept her focus on Christ. He held her up. They passed the fountains, empty of water in the cold weather months, and reached the stage. Denise paused to gaze at it, remembering the summers they'd both had roles. Because of Denise's terrible singing voice, she'd never been cast as a main character, but Brittany had played a couple of important parts. Do you ever miss it? Not even a little. When I left LA, I left all those dreams behind, and I've never looked back. Never let myself look back. Good for you. They started walking again and reached the edge of the park where they could gaze out over the harbor. Brittany stared toward the islands. The wind caught her hair, and with her height, her strength, she brought to mind a stately, beautiful figurehead that would lead sailors to unknown lands. But Brittany's next remark crushed the image. I regret ever going, to tell you the truth. Oh, Denise hadn't expected that. We had some fun, didn't we? She shrugged. You started getting roles right away. It was different for me, frustrating. I felt like I had something to offer, but nobody saw it. I'm sorry about that. I wish it had been different for you. Emotion tightened her throat. I wish I'd been different for you. Brittany squeezed her hand, lips spreading into a genuine smile. You were a good friend. I'm happy where I am now. I'm happy with my gallery. I'm dating this guy, and it might turn into something, you know? I get to travel, meet artists. It's a good gig. I'm happy for you. They watched the waves lap the shore. Thanks to all the little islands, so close they were connected to the mainland by bridges, the waves were gentle, though the surface was choppy. The weather still held, but it felt like a storm was coming. Anyway, Denise said, I need to talk to you about something. Okay. Actually, my bodyguard wants to ask you some questions. Do you mind? Brittany dipped toward Denise, lowering her voice. You mean that hot guy who's been following us? Her gaze darted toward John, who was about 20 feet behind them. That's him. He's, Her eyebrows waggled. Hubba hubba! Denise laughed. Get a grip, you just said you had a boyfriend. Do you? Or do you have a little Kevin Costner Whitney Houston action going on? She wasn't about to admit she'd thought about the Bodyguard movie more than once since she'd met John. Don't be ridiculous. Her words were vehement, if slightly amused, but she felt her cheeks burning. Brittany just laughed. Then she looked around. I assume the other guys hovering are with you too? I don't remember you being so paranoid. That's what we wanted to talk to you about. Brittany backed up. Okay then, fire away. Denise waved John over, and he approached, hand outstretched. I'm Donley. Brittany. Do you mind if we start back to the car? Fine by me. Brittany moved toward the road, and they fell into step beside her. We're investigating the starlet slayings. Ms. Masters tells me you used to work with Lauren Leahy. Brittany blinked, surprise clear in her expression. A long time ago. We're trying to find connections among the victims. Did you work with any of the others? I did the makeup for the sitcom Monica Brown starred in, and I worked with Shannon Butler once, when she was a guest star. Good, good, John said. Can you think of anything the three women have in common? Anything the police might be missing? She shrugged. Geez, I don't know. They were all attractive. Were they personable? Short-tempered? They were okay. I mean, Shannon was distracted, barely looked at me while I was doing her face. But she wasn't rude or anything. Monica didn't pay me much attention, but when she spoke to me, she looked at me, which is more than I can say for a lot of people whose makeup I did. Lauren and I were friendly. How so? John asked. Did you see each other outside of work or? No, nothing like that. We just used to joke around a lot. It started when I made a crack about Californians. She wasn't from there? I think somewhere in the middle of the country. Omaha? Oklahoma? I forget. Okay. Did any of them ever talk about having a stalker or about someone they were afraid of? Brittany shrugged. Not to me. Do you know if any of them went to rehab or had a drug or alcohol problem? Not that I know of. Her gaze flicked to Denise's. What's this about? Why are you investigating this? John looked at Denise, giving her the option to answer. There's a chance the killer might be targeting me, Denise said. Brittany gasped, halting in place. She gripped Denise's arm. Oh my gosh! What? How do you… Does the killer let people know before he kills them? I mean, how do you know that? Denise explained about the package that had been delivered to her agent's office. It might be nothing. None of the other victims had anything delivered. Wow. Brittany started walking again, more slowly this time. Wow. Is that why you're here? To get away from him? I'm here for Ella. It didn't hurt that there was a killer hunting down actors, though. I'm sure. Brittany walked in silence a few moments, then shook her head quickly. Anyway, rehab? I don't know. Lauren used to talk about partying. She'd laugh about how people all drank fancy drinks, lemon drop martinis and the like. She claimed to prefer beer, but really, she was stick skinny. How much beer could she have possibly drunk? You don't know if she had a problem with it? John clarified. Sorry, I don't. She walked a few steps, then said, There is one thing, though. I think she had work done. By the expression on John's face, he had no idea what Brittany was talking about. Denise said, Plastic surgery. Oh. She had pretty full cheeks when I worked with her. But later, it looked as if maybe she'd had some kind of implants. Her cheekbones seem higher and more pronounced than they used to be. Really? Denise said. I didn't notice. You didn't look at her face for an hour every day. What about the others? John asked. Maybe, yeah. Monica's nose. The nostrils used to be more pronounced. Shannon, I have no idea. But who doesn't have work done these days? John turned to Denise. Have you? No, but it is pretty common, especially if you consider Botox injections, things like that. He focused on Brittany again. That's a great tip. We'll look into it. Maybe that was the connection among the victims. But it still begged the question, what did that have to do with her?
Chapter 16. Isn't it lovely? John glanced at Denise, who was staring out the window at the storefronts. They were stopped at a light in downtown Portsmouth, so he followed her gaze. It was a cute town, all decked out for Christmas, wreaths on doors and trees in windows, candles and garland, a Santa on the corner, ringing his bell. A few flurries danced across the windshield, carried on the breeze. Denise looked his way, eyes bright and eager. Let's stop and get something warm to drink. We're not in any hurry, are we? She was shivering. Her own fault for agreeing to meet her friend in the park instead of in a nice, safe environment. Why don't you see if you can find a drive-through coffee shop? That's not what I... She sighed and looked away, her expression falling. It's just nice here, all Christmassy and festive. Never mind. Oh, it wasn't about the warm drink. We've been in town for an hour, he said. The park wasn't as empty as I would have liked, and my guys tell me at least one person recognized you and took your photo. It's possible it's already being shared on social media that you're in Portsmouth, which means the person who fired that arrow. It's fine, whatever. Following his GPS, he turned back toward the state highway. But maybe we could stop along the route if you really want to. We passed through that town on the lake. Meredith? Oh, could we? The excitement in her voice had his heart melting despite the cold she'd forced him and his team to endure. He really shouldn't care if she was happy. He should care if she was safe. That was his job, but that he'd made her happy. Sure, if you want, find a place. We'll have to have the guys check it out first, but it should be fine. She tapped on her phone. Here we go. There's a diner. By the time his team had cleared the little restaurant in Meredith, it was nearing 6 o'clock. Grant had already secured a table, so the hostess immediately led them through the casual space which was, like everything else, decked out for the holidays. A Christmas tree in the bar area crowded the tables. Garland wrapped in twinkle lights hung along the edges of the ceiling. Cheerful holiday music played in the background, barely heard above the chatter and laughter and clinks of dishes. The restaurant was busy, almost every table occupied. The 4 bodyguards stationed around the room stood out like the Easter bunny at a Christmas parade. At a table near the wall, Denise chose the seat that had her back to the room. For privacy? John leaned down and whispered, I'll be right over there. He nodded toward the door to the kitchen. Her eyes widened. You aren't going to sit with me? He hadn't known if she wanted him to or not. Now seeing the hurt on her face, he realized he'd guessed wrong. I didn't know if you... we aren't... It's fine. You don't have to. He slid into the chair across from hers. I'd like to, though, if you don't mind. Her expression was shy, and she hid it behind her menu before he could analyze it further. Should we order dinner? I wasn't thinking about the time when I suggested this. I could eat. He lifted his menu as well, trying to study the options. But, were they on a date? No, of course not. She just wanted to stop, and he just happened to be with her. It wasn't a date. It was just 2 people eating together, like a business meal. Right. She set her menu down. Do you want to split something? Split? He'd already picked out what he wanted, steak tips and gravy. Unlike some people I know, I can finish my whole meal. Besides, you're the one who suggested we eat. She shrugged. Mostly I'm just not ready to go home. Maybe I could just nibble off your plate. Men have died for less. She laughed, setting his heart racing. Fine, I'll get my own, but don't be surprised if I don't finish it. Don't be surprised if I help. They ordered. She chose a grilled chicken sandwich. and then settled in to wait. "Tell me about your life," she said. "What do you want to know? Where did you grow up?" "Leominster, Massachusetts." She lifted one eyebrow, looking very Ember Flare, and let her expression press the question. After the server delivered the drinks, John expounded on his short answer. "Dad's a cop. Mom's a history teacher. They keep talking about retiring, but they both love their jobs." "And you have sisters?" "Yup. They're older, though. We weren't close growing up. We are now, as much as we can be living such different lives. And of course, I have Lake." "Whose name is Susanna?" He chuckled, shaking his head. He wasn't sure how he'd react if Denise guessed right. He wouldn't want to lie, but his cousin would kill him if anybody found out her real name. Most of their teammates didn't even know. "Why private security?" Denise asked. "Or were you a cop at one point, like your dad?" "I enlisted after high school. I was a Green Beret." Why had he added that? Was he trying to impress her? Maybe. "Okay, yes." Denise's eyes widened. "That's like special forces, right?" "Yup." "Wow, pretty elite." He shrugged and sipped his drink. "How about you? You went to L.A.? "Nuh-uh. We've talked enough about me." Those sapphire eyes sparkled. "I want to know about you." So John talked. He told her about his years in the service, some of his assignments, how it had felt to be so far from home, often in very different cultures. He told her about the incredible hospitality he'd found in the Middle East, the easy camaraderie among the people in Africa. He told her about friends he'd made along the way, and a few he'd lost when missions went south. Their meals were delivered, and while they ate, he talked. Even as he was sharing, he asked himself why. Why tell his clients so many personal things about himself? The answer was clear enough that it should have put him on his guard. Truth was, he wasn't thinking about her as his client anymore. And he wasn't thinking about her as Denise Masters, movie star. He was thinking about her as a woman he liked, a woman he wanted to get to know better, a woman he wanted to know him. It was a problem. He knew that. But knowing it and doing something about it were two very different things. When he described the time he'd caught frogs at the creek and left them in his oldest sister's bed, he got the reaction he'd hoped for. "You didn't!" Denise seemed mortified. "That's so mean." He just laughed. "Nah, she was tough. She could handle it." "She had to be tough with a brother like you. What did she do?" "There might have been screaming involved, and crying." "You made your sister cry?" He wished that were the case. "No, Julie screamed to Mom. Mom told Dad. Dad got out the paddle." "Ah, so the tears were yours." "Don't judge me. I was 6. Denise just shook her head. He'd eaten his meal, finished hers, and now they were sharing a slice of apple pie, of which she'd taken a single bite. He nodded to the plate in the middle of the table. "That was your idea, you know." "I had some." It was his turn to let his facial expression display his opinion. "I'm full." She pushed the plate toward him. "Go on. You know you want to. How you don't weigh 300 pounds, I'll never understand." He was about to respond when a voice sounded in his ear. "Huge group coming in," Grant said. "You might want to wrap up your date." He caught the man's eyes across the restaurant and glared, but Grant didn't seem at all sorry for the remark. John nodded, and Grant stepped outside. He'd bring the car around. "We need to get the check," John said. "Everything okay?" He got the server's attention and pulled out his wallet. "I'm buying." Denise sounded genuinely shocked. "No, you're not. But this was my idea." As if he was going to let her buy his dinner. Maybe this hadn't been planned as a date, but it had sure felt like one. Even if it hadn't, he didn't let women buy his meals. Rather than argue when the server came with the check, he snatched it, saw the amount, it wasn't exactly the Russian tea room, and dropped a couple of bills on the table. "The car's here. You ready?" Disappointment crossed her features. He guessed one of the reasons she was a good actor was her communicative facial expressions. Made her a good actor, but she had a lousy poker face. "I guess." He'd explained in the SUV why they'd needed to leave so quickly. Most likely the party on their way inside was perfectly innocuous, but they couldn't know for sure. If someone wanted to get close to Denise without raising alarms, the best way to pass the guards without being noticed would be to blend in with a group. If Grant mentioned it, they must have made him nervous. Always better safe than sorry. As soon as he stood, Marcus, who'd been stationed against the wall on the far side of the room, started toward them to follow them out. A guard in front, another behind. It worked to get through a cramped space. But an old woman pushed back in her chair, forcing Marcus to stop. He couldn't exactly push the lady out of the way, but there wasn't an easy path around her in the busy restaurant. John's heart thumped. Just bad timing, nothing else. Obviously, that elderly lady wasn't trying to hurt anybody. Still, he didn't like that nobody had Denise's back. They were a few feet from the front door when it whooshed open, ushering in frigid air and a huge throng of people. John froze to assess the situation. Grant hadn't been kidding. There were at least 15, maybe 20 people. Men, women, kids, all talking, smiling, laughing. One man stood out. Near the back, 6 feet, maybe middle 40s. Hard to tell his weight with all the people in front of him. Stood straight, looked serious, unlike everybody else. His gaze skimmed the restaurant, and John's instincts kicked in. He spoke into his comm. Brown hair, plaid shirt. "See him," Ian said. John took Denise's hand and pulled her toward the bar, shifting so she was in front of him. He urged her past the close tables and chairs and near the Christmas tree against the far wall. She turned when she reached it, and he blocked her with his body. The space was tight, but she should be safe here. Her eyes reflected the twinkle lights on the tree behind him. "What in the—" "It's okay. Just be still." "John, what did you see?" "Probably nothing. I didn't like the idea of walking past all those people. We'll wait here until they're seated. All of them. That'll take forever." In his ear, Grant said, "We're right outside." John tapped his comm. "Guy still there?" Marcus answered, "Yup, searching the restaurant." "For her?" "No way to know. Maybe he's looking for his date." But John had studied every table. There hadn't been a person sitting alone, looking like they were waiting for someone. That didn't mean anything. It was possible the person the guy was meeting hadn't arrived yet. It was possible the guy was just trying to decide if it was worth waiting for a table. It was also possible that somebody had seen Denise, told their social media followers she was there, and this guy had come to see her. A fan? A shooter? A killer? "John!" Denise's voice was stern, and he looked down to find her staring up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Her hair, falling gently around her shoulders, tickled the backs of his hands. When had he put them on her shoulders? It was his imagination, of course, that had him thinking he could feel the heat of her skin through her thick jacket. They were close, too close. He was just trying to protect her. That was all. But her mouth opened the slightest bit, and his body reacted with such a strong surge of desire that it took every bit of his self-control not to bend nearer and brush her lips with his own. Realizing what he was looking at, he snapped his gaze back to her eyes only to find her watching him. She knew. She knew what he was thinking. Was she thinking it too? He tried to step back, but the tree was there, hemming them in. "The crowd moved through," Marcus said. "There's a private room in the back." John tapped his comm device again. "And the man?" "Went with them. It's clear." John stepped back. "You ready?" She blinked several times, then nodded. Taking her hand in his, he hurried to the door and outside. The cold night air blasted him, cooling his desire and snapping him back from that little fantasy. The SUV waited at the curb. Grant was in the driver's seat but started to get out when John approached. "Stay there," John said into his mic. "You're driving." The last thing he needed was to be alone with Denise for one more minute. Chapter 17. It was a long, tense drive back to Denise's house. Silent, except for the chatter of bodyguards in John's ear. Beside him, Grant kept his mouth shut, a necessity considering Denise rode in the back seat, but his opinions were clear in his expression. Marcus, Ian, and Hughes riding in the car behind didn't have to keep quiet. It had started with Marcus's, "What the heck was that? Are you two dating?" Of course, John couldn't defend himself because of Denise's presence, and because he had no defense. He shouldn't have sat with her. He shouldn't have opened up so much to her. And he definitely shouldn't have gotten so close to her in the bar, suspicious character at the door or not. But he'd needed to get her someplace where nobody could see her. What he hadn't needed to do was stand with her, face to face, so close. He hadn't needed to fantasize about kissing her as if they had been on a date. He was glad he couldn't respond to their comments, which started lighthearted but didn't stay that way. John was the boss, and the guys weren't stupid. They didn't make accusations aloud, but he knew the questions they weren't asking. Was there more between John and Denise than there ought to be between a guard and a client? Since the answer to that seemed obvious, the real question was how much more. When they arrived at the house, Marcus, Ian, and Grant spread around the premises. They would be on duty for a few more hours. Hughes and John delivered Denise to the front door. She turned once she was inside, as if expecting him to follow. Without a word, he pulled the door closed, trying not to see the hurt in her expression. He figured the news of what happened had already spread to the rest of his team. When he stepped into the guest house, the looks on the faces staring at him confirmed his guess. The guys were spread out on the floor or seated at the table. Some were smiling as if it were all a big joke, but others clearly took it more seriously. John had expected that, but Lake had been staying at the Coates house, even when she was off duty. When she stepped forward, he knew things were about to get interesting. She said, "Upstairs." "Fine." John marched through the room and climbed the stairs to the second-floor bedroom. One guy was reclining on his air mattress reading. John said, "Give us the room." "Oh, sure." He scrambled up and past them and jogged down the stairs. John closed the door and lifted his hand. "I know." "Do you?" "It was just dinner. She asked me to join her because she didn't want to sit alone." According to the team, it was more than just dinner. "I never took my eyes off the ball." She leaned against the wall and crossed her arms. Lake wasn't like other women, never had been. Not just because of her height, she was nearly 6 feet tall, and not just because of her looks. He was her cousin, but he could admit she was drop-dead gorgeous, despite the severe bun and lack of makeup. But Lake had always carried, an air of fearlessness. As a child, her father had physically abused her mother, John's dad's sister. He'd verbally abused her sisters. But he'd always been careful with Lake. It was as if, even then, he knew she was tougher than he was. Even in the midst of the terrible ordeal she still refused to talk about, she'd remained stoic, strong, and clear-thinking, which was how she and everyone else had survived. When John and Bartlett had started the private security agency, they'd brought Lake on as a partner. She'd been a newbie, learning as they went. In the first couple of years, Bartlett had been a guard too, but as Lake's skills had improved, he'd stepped back. Now Bartlett, who was in his 50s, preferred to stay in Boston and run the company. He made administrative decisions, but in the field, Lake and John were in charge. She was giving him a look she'd perfected over the years, some combination of curiosity and disdain. He hated that look. "There was never a moment that I wasn't thinking about the client's security," John said. "I saw every person who walked in, who walked out, who looked her way. There was a boy, about 11, brown curly hair, who took her picture with his phone. The table at 2 o'clock debated whether she was who they thought she was. One guy at the table at 8 o'clock was dared by his friends to ask for her autograph, but he chickened out. Nobody else paid us any attention." Lake's eyebrows lifted. "I can do my job." "Nobody said you couldn't." "Then what's the problem? Do you think Ian could have dinner with a client and still watch the room?" Ian was their newest hire. He was decent, but his skills needed to be honed. His focus especially. John didn't answer the question because he knew what she was getting at. "You're the boss," she said. "We make rules for a reason. If you don't follow them, how do you expect anybody else to? There are no rules about eating with a client, and there were 4 guards. Technically, I wasn't on duty. I went because I needed to question Brittany." "So you'd planned to take Miss Masters to dinner?" "No. We agreed to 4 in public. Why the extra guard?" "I needed to question Ms. Masters' friend." Lake's eyebrows hiked, but John barreled forward. "I knew I'd be focused on the friend for at least a few minutes. It seemed prudent to have an extra guard." "Denise?" Of course Lake wouldn't let it go. "She doesn't like to be called Ms. Masters. You're the one who came up with the rules." "I know that." She studied him a long moment through narrowed eyes as if trying to read something on his face. He did his very best to keep his expression impassive. But Lake had known him a long time. All their lives. He'd never been able to hide anything from her. Finally, she said, "Is it serious?" "It's nothing." "Are you lying to me or to yourself?" He blew out a long breath and looked away from his cousin's probing eyes. The beige walls were interrupted by windows that faced into the forest on three sides. There was space enough for a king-size bed, a bureau, maybe a couple of chairs or a sofa, though none of those things furnished the apartment yet. Right now, blow-up mattresses, blankets, pillows, and various personal items littered the carpeted floor. Frustrated as he was, he managed to not kick anything as he crossed the room to the window and gazed outside. Snow was falling, heavier than the flurries from that afternoon, but it was still nothing to worry about. A little weather was the least of his problems. Lake approached, and he glanced her way when she stood at an adjacent window. She was looking outside as well. "You're allowed to be attracted to her. Nobody would blame you for that. If what I heard before you walked in is any indication, you wouldn't be the only one." He faced her. "Are the guys talking about her? If they're making cracks or being disrespectful, it'd be like every other job." He focused out the window again, barely suppressing a growl. Lake wasn't wrong, but the idea of anybody disrespecting Denise had his hands clenching. "Is it more than attraction?" Lake asked. "Of course not." "Really?" She leaned one shoulder against the wall and speared him with those dark gray eyes. "Hughes called me on the way back and told me what he witnessed. He's known you a couple of years, and he said he's never seen you talk so much as you did at dinner, and smile and laugh." "I'm not allowed to have fun? With a client?" Lake was right. He knew she was right, even if he didn't want to admit it. He wasn't just attracted to Denise. He was falling for her. He crossed his arms. "What do you want me to do?" She sighed. "I'd say we should trade places, but the Coates trust me at this point. They don't mind me staying there inside. I can't imagine they'd feel the same way about you." He barked a laugh. "I guarantee Coate will never feel the same way about me. They won't let any man get close to Ella. So, I have to stay there, which means you have to stay here, and you're investigating, which means you need to be close." "So, what? What are you saying?" "You need to put somebody inside with her. Do your investigating here in the guest house." He made a show of looking around. "Where? It's not something I want the guys involved in, and Ms. Masters is helping me. She knows a lot more about this industry and the victims than I do." Lake was nodding, thinking it through. "Okay, you keep working in the office, but you can't stay inside with her overnight. And no more dates. It wasn't a, whatever you want to call it. You and Ms. Masters can pursue whatever relationship you want when this is all over. But as long as there are threats, you need to keep your distance. Otherwise, Bartlett's already said." "You called Bartlett?" "He'll replace you. He can be here tomorrow." Bartlett could guard Denise as well as John could, but Denise didn't know him, didn't trust him, and Bartlett wasn't an investigator. John had taken on the new role to keep his mind engaged. Sometimes being a personal security guard could be mind-numbingly boring. Truth be told, he was tiring of the job. He wouldn't mind expanding the personal security agency to include private investigations, but he'd need to prove he had the chops to do it. John didn't want to be dismissed, but if Lake and Bartlett agreed he needed to leave, he'd have no choice. That was the agreement. They all had an equal stake in the company, and majority ruled. "I'll keep my distance," he said. Lake allowed a rare smile. "When we first approached her, I thought she was going to be, well, you know, we've guarded our share of difficult women, but she's not. I can see why you like her. She's impressive, the way she loves her kid, the way she treats people. Even Coate, who's a world-class jackass." Lake wagged her head side to side. "Just with her." Exactly what Denise had said. Still, John had to fight an urge to deck the guy every time he saw him. Lake touched his arm. "It doesn't have to be forever. If you really like her, when this is all over, she's a movie star. I'm a bodyguard. She might find me interesting for an evening, but it would never be more than that." John needed to keep that in mind. He would keep it in mind. And from now on, he'd keep his distance from Denise Masters. John was halfway across the backyard when his phone dinged with a message from James Sullivan, Denise's friend. Found the name of the kid who was obsessed with Denise, Landon McLaughlin. He came camping with his father, Ken. John stopped and tapped out a reply. Can you forward that to Detective Pollard? Much as John would like to look into it himself, he had enough on his plate with the Starlet Slayer and keeping Denise safe. Already did, James replied. Just thought you'd like to know. John responded with a thumbs up, then stood in the middle of the backyard, centering his thoughts. The snow had left barely a dusting. Now the clouds were parting, revealing an expanse of star-studded blackness. This far from town, the show was impressive. If it weren't so cold, and if he weren't so focused, he might linger to identify some of the constellations his father had taught him to recognize when he was a kid. Out of habit, he located the Big Dipper and followed the two stars at the edge to the North Star. Sort of amazing that there was a star so perfectly aligned with the North Pole that it never appeared to move. John had a few North Star ideas in his life, beliefs he carried. Even in the middle of missions, surrounded by death and evil, those beliefs hadn't faltered. Like the belief that the strong should always protect the weak. The belief that good and evil weren't just theories, but truth. And it usually wasn't that complicated to figure out which was which. At that moment, things didn't seem so black and white. Did he have to deny his feelings for Denise in order to do his duty? Would he really be a better bodyguard if he didn't care about the client? Or could his concern for Denise not compromise his abilities but sharpen his judgment? He didn't know. He did know that there were rules. Rules he'd helped to establish. If he wanted his team to follow them, then he needed to do the same, regardless of how little he wanted to. He rounded the house, climbed the steps to the front porch, nodding at the posted guard on his way, and knocked. The door swung open. Denise had changed out of the pretty slacks and sweater and into one of the fuzzy, comfortable outfits she wore when she was home for the night. He had no idea what that fabric was, but it looked very touchable. Denise hadn't even asked who it was. He considered mentioning her lack of concern for personal safety, but discarded the idea as she gazed at him with cautious, guarded eyes. The way he treated her in the car, and when he'd walked her to the door, he'd hurt her feelings, that much was clear. Mind if I come in? Leaving the door open, she moved to the sofa and sat, crossing her ankles on the cushions beside her. The TV was bright in the dimly lit room. The action paused. On the screen, Shannon Butler smiled at her co-star. It was a romantic comedy, he thought. He stepped in and closed the door. Every time I turn on the TV, Denise said, one of her movies is playing. Now that she's dead, everybody loves her. John settled on the chair adjacent to her. Did people not like her before? Denise lifted one shoulder and let it drop. Some did, some didn't. It's so sad. She was a nice person, just a nice, ordinary person. They put our images on the screen, and suddenly we look larger than life. But we're not. We're just normal people who happen to be able to act. And now, because of her job, she's gone. I'm sorry for your loss. She shook her head and smiled, though not the wide, joyful expression he'd come to expect. I'm fine. Being a little maudlin, I guess. Someone you know was murdered. It's normal to grieve. I try not to be melodramatic. You aren't. At all. He clasped his hands together. We need to talk. She gave him a wary look. Am I in trouble? Not you, me. Because we had dinner together? He nodded. And because of what happened after, in the bar. You mean nothing? Because nothing happened. Rather than argue, he said, my team, they got the wrong idea. Did they? Was Denise being coy, or shy, or self-conscious? Or was she serious? Had the attraction he'd felt only come from his side? As much as he'd like to skirt the question or avoid it altogether, that wasn't the kind of man he was. He was a face it and deal with it kind of guy, even if it was awkward, even if it hurt. This was probably going to hurt. He pulled in a deep breath for courage. I don't think they did get the wrong idea, that is, at least not on my part. She lowered her feet to the floor. What are you saying? I'm attracted to you, of course. Of course he was. He was talking to Denise freaking Masters, movie star. What was he thinking? Every man in America is attracted to you, so that's no big thing to you. The point is, What was the point? He needed to pull it together. My behavior was unprofessional, and I'm sorry. There. That was all he needed to say. Well, that and obviously, after what happened, it's not appropriate for me to stay in the house with you at night, but you will need someone inside. Grant has the most experience. So unless you have an objection, no, absolutely not. If not him, then I don't need anybody to babysit me. If you don't want to stay in the house, then I'll stay alone. It's not that I don't want to. He kept his voice level, showing none of the frustration he was feeling. It's not appropriate. She stood and crossed her arms, but the aggressive stance didn't hide the moisture filling her eyes. Was she crying? What the heck was he supposed to do with that? I'm not trying to hurt you, he said. I'm trying to do the right thing. To abandon me? That's right. He stood as well. I'm staying on the property on the case. I just can't stay in the house with you at night anymore. I need to keep my distance. Why? The single word carried such hurt, such pain. How had a simple conversation gone so awry? I just told you, I'm attracted to you. You also said every man in America is attracted to me. So why would I be better off with one of the others? He'd walked right into that, hadn't he? I don't know them, she said. I don't trust them. It's not easy for me to... She swiped at her tears. To what? Trust. People. If they're attracted to me too, then why should I trust them and not you? You can trust me. That's not the problem. It's that they're not attracted to you like I am. What does that mean? Do I really have to spell it out? Apparently. He blew out a frustrated breath and sat again. I like you, okay? More than I should. I like you. He didn't know how else to say what he was saying. Well, I like you too. She hurled the words like an insult. So by all means, let's not spend time together. By all means, send in somebody who doesn't like me, who doesn't care about me. That'll be so much better. He couldn't figure out if she didn't understand what he was saying, or if she did and didn't see the problem with it. Please, sit down. She settled on the sofa again, though perch would be a better word, ready to spring up and run. Denise. He would have to stop calling her that, even in private. Once they got this awkward conversation over with, he would. I'm developing feelings for you, feelings that go beyond friendship. He expected her to lean away to be repelled, maybe to laugh in his face, but she smiled that easy smile. Really? It's not okay. His words came out harsh. For a million reasons, it's not okay. But the biggest reason is that you're a client and I'm your bodyguard. I need to keep my professional distance. She opened her mouth, closed it again, seemed to consider what he was saying. It was a moment before she asked, You can't guard me if you care about me? It's against the rules. As the lead, I need to be a good example, and I can't do that if I'm sleeping under the same roof with a woman I want to be with. Her eyebrows hiked. You want to be with me? He let out a groan and pushed to his feet. You're missing the point entirely. What if I want to be with you too? That silenced him. In fact, that remark chased all coherent thought from his mind. She couldn't mean it, not the way he did. Not that he was planning their future or naming their kids, but I'm not really a casual fling kind of guy. Her jaw dropped. Do I come off as a casual fling kind of girl? I'm just saying that if you were to settle down with somebody, it wouldn't be with somebody like me. How had they gotten here? He wished he were recording this conversation so he could go back and study the transcript, figure out where it all went wrong. Her head tilted to the side. Why do you say that? Because you're... He waved toward her as if to encompass her amazing, beautiful, talented self. Denise Masters, and I'm an ordinary human being who happens to have a job that makes her famous. Otherwise, I'm just like you. Okay, maybe he could see that. Maybe if he weren't so affected by her, he'd even agree. He'd protected his share of famous people. He wasn't intimidated by fame or money or power. Even so, he said, you're the client and it's not appropriate. Grant is competent. He'll stay in the office. You won't even have to see him. No, How about Hughes, then? He's the one with, I know who he is. I can stay by myself. After the other night, you guys aren't going to let another arrow come through the window, right? I'll be fine. Don't be obstinate. She reared back as if he'd hurt her. You think that's what this is? That I let you stay inside? Her blue eyes flashed. You have no idea how hard it is for me to trust. I wouldn't sleep a wink if another man were in the house with me. I trust you. I don't even know why I trust you, but I do. The rest of them, no, it's either you or nobody. He considered his options. It was good that Lake had developed a rapport with Ella and her parents, but Ella wasn't the one in danger, and she had Reed and Jackie in the house to take care of her, whereas Denise was alone. Outside guards would suffice at the Coates house. All right, I'll get Lake. Ella needs Lake. I want her to stay there. I'll be fine. He forced a deep breath and told himself to be patient. Lake can stay. I will not compromise my daughter's safety. Lake stays with Ella. You're serious. As a death threat. He really wished she'd chosen a different simile. He dropped his head and rubbed the back of his neck. What was he supposed to do now? I'll talk to Lake. I'm not kidding, John. Lake stays with Ella or... No, I mean, she's my partner. I'll ask her what she wants me to do. Fine. Denise snatched the remote and started the movie playing again. This conversation had not gone how he'd imagined. Not at all. He was frustrated and irritated and had no idea what to do. Because he didn't want to leave her alone in the house. Never mind that they did it with clients all the time. It felt dangerous. Too dangerous. But the thought that kept creeping back in as he let himself out and walked to the guest house was, she liked him too.
Chapter 18. Denise wasn't going to think about what a terrible night's sleep she'd gotten. She'd sounded so confident telling John she didn't need a babysitter, that she could stay in the house by herself. And she could. Of course she could. Only she'd gotten used to John's presence, knowing he was sleeping in the office and would be by her side in seconds if there were any danger. It had helped her rest. But he and Lake had decided the guards could keep her safe from outside. That wasn't what she'd wanted, what she'd hoped. She'd wanted them to decide John needed to stay in the house with her. Propriety be hanged. In the light of day, she knew he'd made the right choice, little though she liked it. She wasn't supposed to just avoid impropriety. She was supposed to avoid the appearance of impropriety. By refusing to stay in the house with her, John had protected her. She should be grateful. She would be grateful. She finished her first cup of coffee and her morning Bible reading and prayer, and then showered and dressed. That was one benefit of being alone in the house. She didn't have to get dressed before leaving her bedroom. A soft knock on her front door had her hurrying to get her shoes on. John still had an investigation to run, and all his materials were in her office. She couldn't help the way her heart raced at the thought of seeing him, even after their argument the night before. He was probably still irritated with her, but even so. He liked her. He'd said so. He wasn't just attracted to her, but developing feelings for her. Many men had shown interest in her over the years. Since she'd returned to the Lord, she'd dated, even gotten involved with a few guys, but they'd never felt like more than placeholders, men to attend events with, to share a meal with. She hadn't gotten the impression any of them cared that much for her, and she certainly hadn't cared for them. Those relationships had petered out. But John... She raced down the stairs and pulled the door open to a different bodyguard on the stoop. Grant didn't bother smiling and seemed devoid of personality, but then so had John at first. FedEx came. She took the large envelope, forcing a smile past her disappointment. Thanks. It was just her daily mail delivery from Monroe. Agent Frank had let them know the day before that Monroe had been cleared of any suspicion and was not a suspect. She was glad to know it. She'd hated to think she'd allowed a serial killer to stay in her house. The guard bent and grabbed a box on her stoop. And Amazon. She'd ordered something nearly every day since she'd arrived, mostly stuff for her kitchen. She had a bad habit of online shopping when she got bored or frustrated or lonely or scared. By the time the serial killer and the local shooter were in custody, she'd have purchased enough Christmas stuff to decorate the White House and outfitted her kitchen to suit the fussiest chefs. She carried the mail and package to the kitchen counter and refilled her coffee, trying not to think about John. John, who liked her. John, who seemed to believe they weren't suited to each other because he was a bodyguard and she was an actor. He was wrong about that. Denise might live the whole rich and famous lifestyle back in LA, but she was still a small-town girl at heart. She didn't need glamour or spotlights to be happy. She liked her work, of course, but all the stuff that went along with it just made her life more difficult. What she needed was a good relationship with her daughter, friends who could be counted on, and a few accountability partners to help her grow in Christ. And maybe, someday, a man to share her life with. She hated to admit it, but John couldn't be that man. She and John weren't suited for each other, but not for the reasons he believed. She'd spent a good deal of her nearly sleepless night thinking and praying about him, and the Lord reminded her of one very important fact, one she'd wrestled with a lot more than the fear that kept her eyes popping open. John wasn't a believer, and until he was, they couldn't be together. It was that simple, and that awful, because she was developing feelings for him, and now she knew he returned them. But God had her best interests at heart. Much as it didn't seem true, she reminded herself that he didn't make rules to ruin people's lives or squelch their joy. He made them because he knew what was best. So, hard as it was, she would trust him, which meant, despite her feelings, she had to keep her distance from John, which was exactly what John wanted. That thought didn't make it any easier. After fixing herself a piece of toast and finishing off her second cup of coffee, she opened the packet Monroe had sent and slid out a couple of bills and a few advertisements. Why did he feel the need to forward those? There was one thick envelope. The return address told her it was from her agent. His office forwarded fan mail occasionally, but those always came in a manila envelope, not a business-sized one like this. Was this a contract? Had the studio finally agreed to Denise's terms? If so, why hadn't Bruce called? She sliced open the top with a knife and pulled the papers out. The top sheet wasn't a letter from Bruce. It was a black and white photograph of a beautiful Asian woman. She looked vaguely familiar, but Denise couldn't come up with her name. That didn't stop her hands from trembling. Had the killer left another packet at Bruce's office? If so, why hadn't Bruce called? Why send it along? It was the police who needed this, not her. It didn't make sense, and flipping to the next page didn't help. It was a newspaper article. The woman's name was Lorelei Cho. She'd starred on a TV show for years, but according to the article, hadn't landed another role after the show's final episode. It was a fluff piece, an article to keep an actor's face fresh in the minds of the viewing audience. Denise grabbed her phone and dialed. Bruce answered on the second ring. "Are you all right?" At the worry in his tone, she glanced at the clock. She'd forgotten about the time difference. It was 9:15 in New Hampshire, which made it 6:15 on the West Coast. "Why did you send me this?" He cleared his throat. "What are we talking about?" "Lorelei Cho?" "Lorelei? What about her?" "Your office sent me an article about her. Is she—" Denise couldn't say the words, didn't even want to think them. "Did something happen to her?" "I have no idea." "Then why did you send me this?" Panic filled her voice, and she worked to temper it. "Why would you—" "I didn't send you anything, Denise. Someone in your office mailed me a letter with an article about this actor." "Okay, just—" He took a breath. "Why do you think it came from my office?" "The return address. It's your logo. Send me a photo of it, please." She snapped a picture of the envelope and the article she'd received and sent them. A moment later, Bruce said, "It's not from us. I have envelopes with our logo and address printed right on the paper. That looks like a sticker." She felt the edge of it on the envelope. "It is," which meant she'd been fooled into opening it. "I'm calling Agent Frank," Bruce said. "Sit tight." "Wait, is she— Lorelei? Is she okay?" "Far as I know. She's one of my clients, but I haven't heard from her in a few weeks. I'll call you back." The line went dead. Denise stood in the kitchen, unsure what to do next. Maybe she should call the police, or call Frank herself. Or She hurried to the front door and yanked it open. "Grant!" She hadn't meant to shout, but her heart was pounding. If this was from the killer, maybe they still had time to save Lorelai. Maybe she could do something besides hide. The man standing at the bottom of her stoop turned. "Yes, ma'am. I need to talk to John. Now." "On it." She slammed the door and paced until, about 2 minutes later, she heard a knock. She yanked open the door, and John stepped in. "I'm sorry. I meant to tell you about the fence last night. I know it's ugly, but I got another package." "What fence?" His eyebrows lowered, and he gave her that intense look she was getting accustomed to. "Never mind. Show me." In the kitchen, she slid the package across the island to him. He glanced at the photograph first. "Do you know her?" "No, I talked to Bruce." She explained about the return address, and John peered at the envelope. "He says it's not from his office." John yanked his cell from his pocket and dialed. "John Donnelly and Denise Masters for Agent Frank." He listened, then said, "As soon as possible." "Thank you," he ended the call. "Frank's on another call. Probably with Bruce. He said he was going to call him." John spread the papers out and read. Denise rounded the island to stand beside him and skimmed the article again quickly, thinking of the bits of information John had on the butcher paper taped to the office wall. Job: out of work. Age: 34. Looks: Lorelai was Asian with long black hair and black eyes. Gorgeous, but only one of the other Starlet Slayer victims had been of Asian descent. Connection to Denise: they were both Bruce's clients. The article didn't say where she lived currently, but she'd grown up in Hawaii. Hawaii! She was probably the only victim from Hawaii. But that thought sparked another. Where were the other victims from? "Do you mind if I take this back to the office?" John asked. "Go ahead." He gathered the papers and walked out while Denise tapped the first victim's name into her laptop. Lauren Leahy was from Alabama. The second victim, Erica Martine, was from Connecticut. The third victim, Arizona. Bloomington, Indiana. Mount Vernon, Missouri. Clover, South Carolina. Thornton, Colorado. Shannon Butler had grown up in Omaha, and Lorelai Cho, assuming she was a target, was from Hawaii. 9 female actors, and not a single one of them from California. Not that it was that unusual. People came to California from all over the country, all over the world, to break into the movies. But California was a very populated state. What were the chances that every single victim would come from elsewhere? And what did it mean? Was somebody offended that these women had grown up outside of California? Maybe the killer was from California and wanted to break into the movie business and saw outsiders as a threat? That didn't ring true. But what else could they all have in common? How could being from elsewhere? Her body reacted before her brain caught up. Her stomach dipped, her heart thumped. But it couldn't be. It couldn't be. With now trembling fingers, she typed in the first victim's name, adding the word discovered. It took some digging, lots of perusing of articles. It took patience. An hour, maybe more passed, as she stood at her bar and studied her laptop. But she had the information. Lauren Leahy had been acting in community theater when she'd gone to a casting call in Birmingham. Erica Martine had been discovered at a casting call in Hartford, Connecticut. Jane Sanderson, victim number 3, had been discovered at a casting call in Phoenix. The 4th victim had been discovered at a casting call in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The 5th victim, St. Louis, Missouri. Charlotte, North Carolina. Denver, Colorado. Shannon Butler had been discovered at a casting call in Omaha, Nebraska. Lorelai Cho, Honolulu, Hawaii. Denise was from Coventry, New Hampshire. She swallowed, the action painful, with the fear building in her throat. She had been discovered at a casting call in Manchester. Something slid over her shoulder, and she gasped, turned, lifted her hand to defend herself, and aimed a punch. He grabbed her arm before her fist connected with his face. "Whoa, whoa! It's just me!" John's voice penetrated her fog. "I said your name a couple of times, but—" The surprise leached from his expression, replaced by concern. "What is it?" His voice was low, almost angry. I figured it out. He stared at her as he lifted the phone to his ear. Frank, I'll call you back. He ended the call. Tell me. She would. She had to. She breathed deeply, trying to slow her racing heart. She was safe here. She was safe with John. He wrapped his arm around her waist and urged her to the kitchen table, where she sat and stared toward the slider. The curtain had been pulled closed, but a sliver of glass remained visible, allowing her a tiny glimpse of the world beyond. Less than an inch of snow had accumulated the day before. It clung to tree branches and rested on grass, but left too much green and brown showing for this to be confused with any kind of winter wonderland. All the snow in the world couldn't cover up the ugliness she wanted more than anything to hide. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Except it wasn't, which meant she knew who the killer was. She sat like that a long time. John watched her, but she couldn't bring herself to look his way. Finally, she worked up the courage to ask, Lorelei Cho? He cleared his throat. She was at her vacation home at Big Bear Lake. It took a few phone calls and a cop driving up there to knock on her door, but... He didn't finish. He didn't have to. She's dead! She caught his nod out of the corner of her eye. Did you know her? She was one of Bruce's clients. He spoke highly of her. John said nothing, just waited. None of the victims were from California. Okay, is that unusual? A lot of actors aren't, but plenty are. Seemed quite the coincidence, 9 out of 9. Finally, she faced him. While you were back in the office, I did some research. All the victims had responded to casting calls near their hometowns. I wrote a list. She waved toward the counter, and John snatched the paper from beside her laptop, where she'd written the 9 names, where they were from, and where they'd gone to casting calls. What does that mean, casting calls? It's an open audition. Denise towed the curtains open a little more, not caring that they were supposed to remain closed. The scene outside was tranquil, the trees swaying in a breeze, the sky ice blue behind them. A guard hovered near her back door, but she couldn't see him from where she sat. A black chain-link fence had been erected around her property. It was ugly, but probably the best they could do, considering how fast it had gone up. She didn't care. It didn't matter. So, anybody can go to them? John clarified. She nodded. Casting calls are common in LA, of course. Less common in... She nodded to the paper in his hand. Fort Lauderdale. Wayne, Indiana. Okay. There's this one casting director, Hubert Vaughn. The name felt like mud in her mouth. He used to be a casting director anyway. Now he's a producer and a director, and he wears different hats. Depending on the project, yeah. He's known for finding talent all over the country. Used to, whenever he'd cast a movie, he'd do a casting call near where it was supposed to take place, try to find local talent. It ginned up support for the movie, got people interested. You think these women all went to his casting calls? I'm sure of it. Are you saying you think somebody is targeting women who were discovered at these casting calls? She didn't miss the skepticism in his voice. Not just somebody. I think... She swallowed hard. I think it's Hubert Vaughn himself. He leaned toward her. You think the man who discovered these women is killing them? Why? She rubbed her lips together. Denise. Her gaze flicked to his, but didn't hold. Did you go to one of this guy's casting calls? She nodded. Her eyes filled, and a tear escaped. She flicked it away. Hey! His voice was calm, gentle. He slid his hand over hers. She fought not to yank it back. What happened? She had to tell him. There was no other choice. If this was the reason women were dying, somebody had to tell the truth. I was young and depressed, and there was the casting call. I didn't tell Reed because I knew he'd disapprove. And I mean, of course he would. Ella was just a couple of months old. Why couldn't I just be happy? But since I didn't tell him, I didn't want to ask anybody to watch her, because then I'd have to lie, and I didn't want to lie. So I took her with me. It was a long day, a very long day, and she was fussy. But I managed it. I fed her, I took care of her. I might have been depressed, but I was a good mother. I was. Of course you were. Brittany auditioned too, and she watched Ella when it was my turn. The whole thing had felt bizarre. Before she'd arrived that morning, she'd assumed she'd audition on a stage, though she didn't know why she'd thought that. Instead, she'd read her lines in front of a long table with 3 people seated on the far side in an otherwise empty office space. She'd recognized Hubert Vaughn, but not the others. She'd been so nervous, but she thought she'd done a decent job. They'd waited in a cramped lobby to hear the results. One by one, the other people had been released, including Brittany. Eventually, only Denise and Ella remained. I thought he was going to cast me in something, that I'd been good. I was taken back to this office. It was empty except for a table, a couple of chairs, and a sofa. It was just me and Vaughn. And of course, I had Ella. I left her in her stroller by the door. She was sleeping. He told me how good I was, how I could make it in Hollywood. And then, he was... She couldn't say it, but she could remember his words of praise. How amazing she was. How she could be a star. He had just the role for her. And then he'd joined her on the sofa, held her there. John squeezed her hand. Did he hurt you? She nodded, then shook her head. Sort of. I didn't. All I could think was how I couldn't let Ella get hurt. Not that he would have. I wasn't thinking clearly, I guess. I didn't want her to hear me scream. I didn't want her to know. I tried to get away, but... John touched her shoulder, but she flinched and he dropped his hand. She said, I'm sorry, I don't mean... You don't owe me an apology. His voice was gentle, soothing. And then you left? It hadn't been quite that simple, but she didn't need to tell him the whole ugly story. He gave me a card and told me I had a job if I wanted it. He'd written an appointment time on the back. Said to be there, that I'd be perfect for the role. That's why you left your family. Her gaze snapped to John's. No, of course not. You think I wanted to go work for that. No. Okay. He remained calm, though she saw something in his eyes that belied the rest of his face. What happened? I couldn't forgive myself. I'd put my daughter in danger. I'd cheated on Reed. John angled back. You didn't cheat, Denise. You were raped. She flinched. She hated that word. Right? He asked. Did I misunderstand? Yes. That's what... But I didn't know how to deal with it. She studied her lap, afraid to meet his eyes. I felt like I'd betrayed my husband. I went to the casting call without telling him. I took our daughter without telling him. And then that happened. I put Ella in danger. I was with another man. You weren't? I know, but at the time I couldn't process it. I couldn't deal with it. Vaughn made it out like, when it was over, like we'd done this thing together. Like I'd had a choice. And it was easier to think that I did. That I'd been in control, allowed it. That if I'd tried harder, I could have escaped. So I must have been in control. You couldn't have. The certainty in John's voice had her turning to him. Maybe if you'd screamed, somebody would have come. But probably not. Because if he did that to you, then the people he was with were either gone. Somebody led me to his office. Or complicit. Because Vaughn couldn't know if you were going to scream or not. And if you're saying you think all these victims were assaulted, then the people working for this piece of garbage had to know. He snapped his jaw shut, and a muscle ticked in his cheek. I don't care how good of shape you were in, and... He swore under his breath. You'd just had a baby, which means there's no way you could have fought off a grown man. No way. The intensity in his gaze dared her to disagree with him. Okay. It wasn't your fault, Denise. I know. I mean, sometimes it's easy to let my thoughts, to forget that. He's the one who did something wrong. It's just that what happened that day led to everything else. But you didn't go to Hollywood to work for him. No, I stayed with Reed and Ella for another couple of months. I tried to get over it. I tried to be happy. But I couldn't make it work. I was so... off. Between the postpartum and then that, I couldn't function. After a while, I convinced myself everybody would be better off without me. so I left.